He thought he could trap Karoline Leavitt, but instead, she turned the tables and exposed his biggest lie on live TV. The studio lights shone brightly, reflecting off the polished glass desk where the night's main event was about to begin. The network's top political talk show, The Evening Pulse, was known for being a battleground, and tonight was no different. Seated on one side of the desk, leaning forward with his signature smirk, was Graham Walters, the network's top political commentator. A seasoned host with decades of experience, he had a well-practiced style. Interrupt, rephrase, dominate. His audience expected him to outmaneuver his guests, especially conservatives. On the other side, Karoline Leavitt sat poised and ready, adjusting the lapel microphone on her navy blazer. She knew exactly what she was walking into. She wasn't naive. This was enemy territory, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, was not on her side. As the intro music faded, the showdown was about to begin. The camera zoomed in, and Graham wasted no time. Tonight, we have with us Karoline Leavitt, former Trump White House assistant press secretary and political commentator. She's here to talk about the state of the economy, media responsibility, and some, let's say, controversial claims she's been making about our network. He chuckled, shaking his head slightly, as if he already knew this was going to be an easy win. Karoline, let's start with something simple. You've been very vocal about what you call media manipulation. You claim networks like ours intentionally mislead the public. That's a pretty serious accusation. Where's your proof? Karoline didn't flinch. She kept her expression calm, even as she felt the subtle shift in the audience's energy. They were waiting for her to stumble, to second-guess herself. But she didn't. Graham, I don't need to claim anything. The proof is in your own reporting, she said smoothly, tilting her head slightly. Let's talk about inflation. Last year, this very network told Americans that inflation was transitory, that it was just right-wing fear-mongering. Now here we are. Everyday families can barely afford groceries. Eggs are up 30%, gas prices are through the roof, and suddenly you're all acting like this is brand new information. So tell me, was it incompetence or dishonesty? The smile on Graham's face twitched. He had expected pushback, but not like this. Well, Karoline, economics is complex, and no one could have predicted. She cut in, her voice sharp but controlled. No one? Or just the media? Because there were experts warning about this for months, but they weren't the ones you put on air, were they? The crowd shifted. Some murmured. Graham leaned back in his chair, gripping his cue cards a little tighter. Look, we report facts, and if you want to cherry-pick... Cherry-pick? Karoline pressed on. Okay, let's talk about crime. Your network spent months running segments about mostly peaceful protests while cities burned. You downplayed riots. You ignored business owners losing everything, and now suddenly crime is a serious issue because polling says voters care about it. So which is it? Did crime just appear out of nowhere, or did you all ignore it because it didn't fit your narrative? Graham exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting in his seat. The usual rhythm of his interviews wasn't working. Normally, by this point, his guests would be stammering, backpedaling, or trying to deflect. But Karoline wasn't rattled, and the audience could feel it. Still, Graham wasn't about to let her take control. He straightened up, ready to turn the tide. The heat turned up even higher as Graham's fingers drummed lightly on the desk while he recalibrated. He wasn't about to let Karoline control the narrative. He had taken down tougher opponents before, senators, CEOs, even former presidents. All right, Karoline, he said, forcing a chuckle as he leaned forward. You're passionate, I'll give you that. But let's be real here. Conservative media does the exact same thing you're accusing us of. They push their own agenda, spin stories, ignore facts. Do you seriously expect people to believe that only liberal networks are guilty of this? It was a classic move. Flip the accusation, paint her as a hypocrite. He expected her to fumble, to get defensive. She didn't. Take the bait. Oh, I fully acknowledge that media bias exists on both sides, she said without hesitation. The difference is your network pretends it doesn't have one. Fox News, for example, doesn't hide that it leans conservative. But your network? You sell yourself as the neutral voice, the trusted source, and that's the problem, because you're not. Graham's jaw tightened slightly. The audience might not have noticed, but Karoline did. You say you report facts, she continued, her tone unwavering. So let's test that right now. Crime is skyrocketing in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and San Francisco, all Democrat-run. But if someone watches your network, they'd think crime is just a right-wing talking point. That's dishonest. Why don't you just say the truth? That's ridiculous, Graham shot back. We cover crime when it's convenient, she interrupted. Your network only started covering the recent crime wave after swing state voters ranked it as a top concern. Before that, you called it hysteria. I mean, come on, Graham. Do you really expect people not to notice? His lips pressed together. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Let's talk about January 6th, then. He pivoted quickly, his voice gaining an edge. You want to talk about selective outrage? Your side defends what happened that day while condemning other protests. You call for law and order, except when it's your people breaking the law. So tell me, Karoline, how do you justify that? A murmur rippled through the audience. Now he had her. At least, that's what he thought. Karoline inhaled deeply, nodding as if she expected the question. Graham, I've said from day one that anyone who committed a crime that day should be prosecuted. But let's compare that to what your network did in 2020. You downplayed months of riots, looting, and violence as mostly peaceful. You defended politicians who bailed rioters out of jail. And yet, January 6th is treated like the single greatest threat to democracy, while entire cities burned under policies you refuse to criticize. That's the double standard, and Americans see it. The studio fell uncomfortably quiet. Even some of the panelists looked toward Graham, waiting for his response. He needed to regain control. So what, Karoline? You're saying we shouldn't talk about January 6th, he said, his voice laced with frustration. No, I'm saying tell the truth, she replied firmly. Cover both. Hold everyone accountable. Not just when it's politically convenient. That's what real journalism looks like. For a split second, Graham hesitated. His mind scrambled for the next move, the next attack. But the energy in the room had shifted, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he was the one in control anymore. Graham forced a grin. The kind of grin that masked irritation. He wasn't used to losing ground this early. His guests typically buckled under pressure, struggled to keep up. But Karoline wasn't flustered. She wasn't scrambling. If anything, she was settling in, taking her time, making every word count. All right, he said, exhaling through his nose, flipping his cue cards for a new angle. You've had your moment, but let's talk about something else. Misinformation. You and others on the right love to throw that word at us, but your side is guilty of spreading just as many lies. Take the election fraud claims, for example. Karoline lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. Wait, hold on, she said, tilting her head. You're talking about misinformation? Graham blinked. Yeah, he said slowly. Okay then, let's really talk about it. The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. For months, your network told people that if they got the COVID vaccine, they wouldn't get infected. Period. You called anyone who questioned it a conspiracy theorist. And now, 2 years later, the same health officials you praised are admitting that wasn't true. That's misinformation, so where was the correction? Where was the accountability? The audience murmured. Graham's eyes flickered toward his producers. He hadn't planned for this detour. That was based on the best available information. The outrage, then? Karoline continued, her tone steady and unshaken. No, she said, shaking her head. That's not how journalism works. The best available information should have included the voices you silenced, scientists, doctors, people who had concerns. Instead, your network demonized them, got them banned from social media, and now you're pretending it never happened. Graham clenched his jaw. All right, you want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your side's responsibility for political violence. You all act like it's only one party at fault, but let's not forget Republicans have pushed dangerous rhetoric, too. Donald Trump told his supporters to fight like hell on January 6th. Some of them listened. People got hurt. How do you defend that? It was a classic play. Bring up Trump, make her defend him, put her on shaky ground. But Karoline wasn't biting. First of all, Graham, I don't defend violence. Ever. But since you brought up rhetoric, let's be consistent. When Senator Chuck Schumer stood in front of the Supreme Court and told justices they would pay the price if they ruled a certain way, and then a man showed up outside Brett Kavanaugh's house with a gun, was your network outraged? No, you barely covered it. Graham opened his mouth, but she kept going. When Maxine Waters told protesters to get more confrontational with political opponents and conservatives were harassed at restaurants, chased out of public spaces, where was the outrage then? The outrage? Where was your call for accountability? Karoline pressed, her voice unwavering. The audience was shifting. The balance of power in the room had tilted, and Graham could feel it. Look, he said, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about cherry-picking incidents. No, Karoline cut in. This is about double standards. That's why people don't trust you. Because if political violence is wrong, and it is, then it's wrong no matter who does it. And if rhetoric is dangerous, and it can be, then you need to call it out everywhere, not just when it helps your ratings. She leaned forward slightly. So, Graham, I'll ask you, can you admit your network applies different standards based on the political party involved? For a fraction of a second, Graham Walters, the man known for always having the last word, hesitated. But that silence said more than any response ever could. He shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the weight in the room. His job was to control the conversation, steer it back to safe waters, but Karoline had flipped the script. And now, for the first time in years, he was the one grasping for footing. His earpiece crackled, a producer, no doubt urging him to cut to a break. He ignored it. He wasn't going to let this moment spiral any further. All right, Karoline, he said, forcing a chuckle. You've made your accusations, but let's be honest. You're part of the same game, rising crime and how it's impacting everyday Americans, Karoline said, holding the paper steady. So tell me, Graham, was crime a scare tactic then, or is it a real problem now? Because it can't be both. Graham leaned back, his smirk faltering for just a second. The right-wing media machine, you're part of it yourself, he shot. Back, grasping for control. You act like an outsider, but you push talking points just like everyone else. If networks like ours are guilty of bias, what makes you any different? It was a last-ditch effort to discredit her, to paint her as just another partisan player. But Karoline didn't flinch. I'm different because I don't pretend to be something I'm not, she fired back. I don't sit behind a desk, claim, I'm objective, and then quietly push narratives that benefit one political party. That's what your network does, Graham. You claim to be fair, you claim to be neutral, but the facts prove otherwise. Graham scoffed, shaking his head. You keep saying facts, Karoline, but all I hear are opinions. And that was the moment, the precise second everything shifted, because Karoline was ready for this. She reached into the stack of papers she had brought with her, a calculated move, and pulled out a printed headline from Graham's own network. She held it up, letting the cameras capture every word. This was your network's headline in 2021. Crime wave is a GOP scare tactic. But fast forward 2 years, and now you're running segments on rising crime and how it's affecting everyday Americans. So which is it? The first to speak. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with unspoken tension. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Graham. So which is it, Graham? Was crime a scare tactic, or is it a real issue now that it's affecting voter sentiment? She didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she reached for another page. Here's another one. Inflation fears are overblown. Economy is strong. You ran this in early 2022 while Americans were already struggling to afford basic necessities. By the end of the year, you admitted inflation was a serious crisis. So what changed? The economy or your willingness to admit the truth? The audience murmured, shifting in their seats. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tightening. But Karoline wasn't done. And this one, she said, pulling out one last sheet, her voice steady. Hunter Biden laptop story is Russian disinformation. Your network ran that. Headline over and over, called it a conspiracy, mocked anyone who even questioned it. But now, even your own journalists admit the laptop was real. And you expect the American people to just forget that? Graham's face darkened. The studio was dead silent. A few rows into the audience, someone let out a quiet, "Wow." The panelists, usually quick to jump in and back Graham up, sat stiff in their seats. No one wanted to be the first to speak, the discussion, to steer the narrative, to keep his guests on the defensive. But now, for the first time, Graham Walters was the one with nothing to say. Karoline set the papers down. So tell me, Graham, where's the accountability? A flicker of something crossed his face. Embarrassment. Frustration. He glanced off camera toward his producers, searching for an escape route. Nothing came. His lips parted slightly as if he were about to speak, to throw out some prepared line, some well-rehearsed dismissal. But nothing came, because there was nothing he could say. And in that moment, the great Graham Walters, the man who had humiliated countless conservative guests, was speechless. The silence stretched longer than it should have. In television, dead air was a cardinal sin. Producers scrambled behind the scenes, trying to salvage the moment, but the damage had already been done. Graham Walters, the man who built a career on controlling conversations, had no response, no witty comeback, no rehearsed deflection. Karoline sat still, watching him, letting the weight of the moment settle in. She didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She just waited. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Some viewers shifted in their seats, glancing at one another as if unsure of what they had just witnessed. The usual flow of the show had been disrupted. The host was supposed to dominate, but not tonight. The guest was supposed to stumble, but this time the script had flipped. A younger panelist, known for repeating the network's usual talking points, cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. Well, that was a lot, he said, with an awkward chuckle. But let's be real, Karoline. The media isn't perfect, sure, but you're acting like one side is completely innocent. Right-wing outlets push misinformation all the time. You expect us to believe they're any better? It was a lifeline, a distraction, an attempt to pull Karoline back into a debate she had already won. She could have taken the easy route, given a standard both sides have their flaws answer, and moved on. But she wasn't about to let them shift the focus. That's not the argument, she said, turning to the panelist. I'm not here to defend anyone. I'm here to hold you accountable, your network, your leadership, your narratives. Every time you're caught misleading the public, you pivot, you blame others, you change the subject. The young panelist hesitated. This wasn't the conversation he had expected. Graham, still trying to recover, finally leaned forward, desperate to regain control. Okay, Karoline, he said, his voice a little sharper now. You've made your point, but let's not pretend this is some grand conspiracy. We make mistakes, sure, But so does every media outlet. That doesn't mean there's an agenda. A weak defense, a last-ditch effort to frame everything as simple human error. Karoline exhaled softly, shaking her head. Graham, mistakes happen, but these aren't mistakes, they're patterns, and patterns tell a story. She gestured toward the papers she had placed on the desk earlier. This isn't just one bad headline or one off-base report. It's years of deception, repeated narratives designed to control public perception. And when the truth finally comes out, your network acts like it never happened. No retractions, no apologies, just silence. Graham shifted in his seat again, but the fight was leaving him. He knew she was right, but admitting it? That was something he simply couldn't do. Behind the cameras, producers were frantic, throwing signals, desperate to regain control. The interview had veered into dangerous territory, and the power they once held over the conversation was gone. Graham glanced at the teleprompter where a new message had appeared. Cut to break. But, too late. The damage was done. The screen abruptly cut to commercial, but the moment had already burned itself into the audience's minds. Back in the studio, tension hung thick. Graham ripped off his earpiece, frustration tightening his jaw as he turned to his producers. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Karoline remained seated, calm, watching the scramble around her. The panelists murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, others stealing uneasy glances at the host. A makeup assistant rushed onto the set, dabbing at Graham's forehead as he exhaled sharply, trying to regain his composure. But there was no coming back from this. Beyond the studio, the damage had already spread. The show was being live-streamed, and within seconds, clips were making their rounds. Short snippets of Karoline holding up the headlines, Graham sitting in stunned silence, then full-length breakdowns with captions calling it a total takedown. The most humiliating moment of Graham's career had gone viral. Twitter was on fire. Breaking. Karoline Leavitt destroys mainstream media hypocrisy live on air. Graham Walters left speechless. Tweets flooded in. Never thought I'd see the day Graham Walters had nothing to say. Iconic. This is what happens when corporate media finally gets called out. They have no defense. No way they let her back on this network again. She just burned their entire narrative to the ground. Within minutes, conservative outlets ran headlines like, Karoline Leavitt obliterates liberal media's lies in explosive showdown. Network host left stammering as guest exposes years of deception. But it wasn't just right-wing media taking notice. Even independent journalists, usually hesitant to pick sides, were sharing the clip, calling it the moment corporate news finally got caught. Meanwhile, the network's PR team scrambled, desperately trying to control the fallout. But the internet had already made up its mind. As the commercial break neared its end, Graham inhaled deeply, forcing a composed expression back onto his face. But the damage had already been done. The makeup artist retreated as the producers signaled 30 seconds. Graham turned to Karoline, his voice lower now, laced with irritation. "We're coming back from break. I suggest you reel it in." Karoline simply smiled. "I don't take suggestions from people who lost the argument." Graham clenched his jaw, but there was no time to respond. The screen flashed back, the intro music played, and the camera zoomed in. He forced on his usual media-friendly grin, but the energy had shifted. The audience wasn't looking at him the same way. They had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and no amount of damage control could change that. The broadcast continued, but it no longer mattered. The moment had escaped their control. The audience wasn't focused on Graham's words. They were replaying the silence, the hesitation, the way Karoline had turned his own tactics against him. He tried to regain the rhythm, to steer the conversation back into safe territory. "All right, let's shift gears," he said, but it was too late. People weren't buying it. In the control room, producers scrambled while network executives, were already on the phone debating how to spin the damage, how to handle the inevitable fallout. Some called for a media blackout. Don't acknowledge it, don't amplify it, let it die out. Others drafted statements, scrambling for a damage control strategy. But none of it would work. Something had changed. Viewers had seen in real time what it looked like when power was challenged, when narratives crumbled under the weight of truth, when someone refused to be silenced, it became something people wouldn't forget. Karoline knew it too. As soon as the segment wrapped, she walked off the set with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout. No gloating, no celebration, just certainty. Near the exit, a younger staffer, probably an intern, hurried to catch up with her. "Miss Leavitt, that was... wow," he said, shaking his head. "They're definitely not inviting you back after this." She smirked. They were never planning to invite me back, and that was the truth. This had never been about fair debate. The network had booked her expecting an easy win, a punching bag to reinforce their narrative. Instead, they had handed her a platform, and she had used it to dismantle their credibility, piece by piece. Outside, the night air was crisp, the city buzzing with its usual energy, but in millions of homes across America, people were still watching the clip, analyzing it, sharing it, and talking about what it meant. Because this wasn't just about one debate. It wasn't just about Graham Walters. It was about something much bigger. People were waking up to the bias, the manipulation, the way truth was twisted, ignored, or buried when it didn't serve the right interests. And no matter how hard the media tried, they couldn't put that awareness back in the bottle. The truth was out, and there was no going back. If you're tired of the deception, if you believe in holding the media accountable, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. More people need to see moments like this. More people need to wake up. Let's keep the conversation going.